Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's so good to be here with you. As Brennan mentioned, my name is Rhett. I may look like a student, but I just realized that this spring is going to be my 10-year high school graduation anniversary. And as the class president of 8 people, that's on me to plan that. Went to a very small high school. So I went here at UTD. I got my degree in marketing in 2017. And then since then, save for 1 year that I was in Denton, I have been a college pastor here at UTD as well. I got married in 2021, last summer, to my wonderful wife, Kaylee. You don't have to stand up. You can. You just don't feel pressure. There we are. And I love it's an enormous blessing to get to know your kids or cousins or whoever the student is that's in your life. As Brandon mentioned, we're in a series on Philippians, and so in the next 10 to 12 minutes, what I'm going to hope to do is teach a little bit about the history and the demographics of the city of Philippi. Because if you didn't know, Philippians, we call it that because it's the letter of Paul to the Philippians. The Philippians are the people who live in Philippi. So if we can go ahead and throw up that first slide. I want you to imagine that kind of any given region, any given city has layers of history that kind of influence those people the way that you would have, layers of soil. And so, you can imagine it like that. And if you go to the next slide, we've got this one we won't spend much time on. But before there was even a city of Philippi, this was essentially, it's a land that's beautiful, right? I mean, look at that. I don't think that house was there at the time. But it's a land with lots of mountains, rivers, forests, and it's located kind of to the north of ancient Greece, and you'll see that in the map later. And in an area that came to be called Macedonia, and Macedonia is Greek for highlands. And this specific area where, that's the region, the specific area where Philippi would eventually be planted was known as Krenides in Greek, and it means springs. So you've got these natural, beautiful mountains, beautiful springs, and so you can imagine there's a lot of farming, a lot of agriculture, and that would have been what their society was built around. But if you've ever studied history, people like to fight and have land. And so, the next kind of section was essentially when they would be defined by just Hellenization and the Greek Empire. And so, in the 4th century, we got a map for this. This is the highest resolution map I could find of this, and it's horrible to look at. So, in the 4th century, there started to be these different kingdoms that were kind of fighting for control of the area. And there are these people called the Thracians, who were from that tiny little island right there, and they were trying to secure their mainland interests. So this area right here, they're trying to take control of that. And they started fighting with the Thracians. Don't worry, it won't be super important to know that. But it came under Greek control. That's what you need to know. And the main way that happened, if you go to the next slide, is that the Thracians, as you can see, they're from this tiny island. They needed some help, right? And so they ally with this man right here, who we can assume originally had a nose. And his name was Philip II of Macedon, right? Because he was from Macedon. And there's this really important battle because Philippi is right there between the Thracian kingdom and the Macedonian kingdom. And at the site of Philippi, there's this huge battle, and the Macedonians win. And Philip says, I've got a perfect name. And he names the city after himself. Which is a pretty arrogant thing to do. You might know Philip as the father of Alexander the Great, right? And so this was kind of part of ushering in just this huge age of Hellenization. And so over the next couple hundred years, they would kind of be part of this Macedonian Hellenized empire, right? And we don't know much about that time, and it's not terribly important for us to know about that. But as near as we can tell, they kind of flourished within that time, but they weren't, down here where more of the important kind of political stuff was happening. So there you go. The next period of time was just this very stressful couple hundred years of Roman wars. That's stressful is an understatement for wars. I've taken it upon myself to censor this statue. It's family night. So yeah, in 148 BC, the Romans gained control of Macedonia. And again, something absurd happens. So the general who took control was Quintus Caecilius Metellus, and they added Macedonius to his name to celebrate him taking control. And over the next, couple hundred years, there would just be these different wars as, first of all, Rome tried to push into that area and expand their empire, and then later the Romans would fight amongst themselves, and things would just kind of settle in. And so what you have is a different Roman Empire kind of reasserting control in this area. And every time that happens, they kind of tell the people who fought under them, hey, this is a beautiful area. Philippi is a beautiful area. The veterans of my army, you can retire there and go live in this beautiful area. And so there's just generations of veterans who fought under different Roman warriors. But finally, things kind of settle down when Claudius kind of conquers it once and for all and ushers in what we call the Pax Romana, right? So this time of relative peace and safety. And if you were living in the area, maybe you were like, hey, I'm glad y'all stopped fighting. But now, if you were a local who had kind of lived there for generations, suddenly you were living in a place that was very different from what you used to know. Essentially, he turned Philippi into a Roman colony, which is like a mini Rome, right? All of the things that you would expect to see in Rome, you could find there on a smaller scale. So there were bathhouses and a public square, and we had, a Colosseum of some kind, a pretty small one, not as nice as the Colosseums we have in Rome, but and so it's a tiny little Rome. As near as we can tell, 10 to 15,000 people lived there. So for perspective, that's like on the upper end, just around half of how many students are at UTD right now. So this is a pretty small area to us, but to them, there was a lot of privileges that came with being in this little Rome. That is the Via Ignatia. It depends on how actually Latin you want to pronounce it, but I went down the middle there. And so it's a Roman road. And so essentially Philippi became this juncture that connected kind of central Roman Empire to the Eastern world. And a lot of trade routes would pass through there. And it became very central to that. And that kind of brought a lot of opportunities to them. But it also ushered in this new reality that you can kind of picture like a staircase. So there are these layers of society. Very unfortunately, at the bottom there would be people who had maybe been part of a war and had become slaves after that, or were servants, like indentured servants for a time, kind of at the bottom rung of society. And then there were people who were farmers or tradesmen of some kind. Maybe they were merchants. And then, very importantly, there was kind of this stage where you could become a Roman citizen. And a lot of people, the veterans, people that had been settled there, had Roman citizenship that had been given to them by Claudius. And essentially, to be a citizen of Rome, even if you were out in this colony hundreds of miles away, it was as if you lived in Rome proper. And there were a bunch of benefits that came with that. For one, there's respect. there was just no getting around, like people looked up to people who were citizens of Rome. But additionally, you got certain tax benefits, tax breaks, and very importantly, if some injustice was being committed against you, you could appeal directly to Caesar and take the case all the way up to him. And so that had a lot of benefits with it. And then after that, that's like the real difference maker was whether or not you're a Roman citizen. But then after that, you've got veterans who are very respected Roman citizens. And you've got certain Roman authorities. You've got the emperor, right? But only like 30% of people were Roman citizens. And so you can imagine that you would really want to move up the staircase of society if you were living there. And there were certain things you could do that would help you move up, and certain things that you could do that would maybe cause you to fall down a stair in this society. So the first thing you could do is become a Roman citizen officially. And there were a few ways you could do that. The main one was if you were a servant, you could serve a certain amount of time and be released, what they called manumission, and you would become a citizen. But on top of that, you could move up society financially by participating in trade. You could move up socially by participating in Roman culture as a whole. And importantly, you could retain your spot in society by participating in what they called the imperial cult. Because again, these emperors would name cities after themselves, and they liked to be looked up to. And so there was a lot of worship of these emperors. And you could solidify your part in society by kind of participating in what happened there. But at the same time, so on one hand, there's the ability to move up. On the other hand, there's this tension and this fragility. So you can imagine the reality of living in a Roman colony was like someone handed you a very thin, expensive wine glass. And it's like, on one hand, wow, this is a really nice thing to have. On the other hand, I don't want to mess up and break this, because that could get dangerous very quickly. This is a fragile thing, right? The nice side of it is access to wealth, the protection of Rome, having Roman culture, having Roman entertainment, things like that. But the fragility of it, for one, you're very aware, I don't want to start any trouble. There have been 4 wars here in 90 years, right? I don't want any of that to happen. And so you would be very careful around Roman authorities. But the things that threatened to make you kind of slip down the staircase were refusal to participate in the cult of the emperor, which was always seen as unacceptable, but the punishments, depending on the emperor, would vary from losing your citizenship to losing your life, right? It just depended on the time. But then also just not participating in Roman culture and getting ostracized. And you can imagine if you're a merchant or a farmer and suddenly you're not participating in what everyone does, you could lose your livelihood. And then mistreating a Roman citizen was a way that you could really lose your status in the society. On top of that, there's the reality of just the tensions between these different classes of society. So you can imagine if you are from a long line of farmers that's lived in this area for generations, and suddenly these arrogant men start fighting over the area. And it just kind of ruins everything you've known. You lived in this quiet countryside, and suddenly there's always a war happening there, or there's always something being built there, and you're always expected to buy into a new culture. And finally, once that settles in, you find that there's been a staircase of society built, and you're at the bottom of society, even though you were there first. And so you can imagine the frustration that these people felt who were colonized, but at the same time, you can imagine the pride that these people felt who were Roman citizens, who had the full protection of Rome, who had fought and been in a war and finally gotten to settle down. And so there's a lot of, just tension between different types of people there. And you can imagine building a church there that you might run into some tensions between the members, right? Peter, you can go ahead and come up. But without giving away too much, I just want you to imagine you're in an area where climbing up the rungs of society is an important thing. It's a Roman culture. You're supposed to worship the emperor. and someone comes in and tells you about Jesus, and Jesus is changing your life, but he is a Jewish God from a different culture, who calls you to call him Lord instead of the emperor, who calls you to find your citizenship in heaven instead of Rome, and who calls you to find your identity socially in the church instead of Rome, who calls you to radical generosity, so you can imagine you're finally building up financially as a merchant, and he's like, if anyone asks you to give, give. And finally, who calls you to be meek and serve others, to essentially run towards the bottom of the staircase. We'll be getting into that more over the next couple weeks, but you can imagine just for a second what that would have been like. So yeah, here's Peter, and he's going to be preaching.